Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the MPP Alumni reunion on this Saturday, the 1st of June. And I think we have to get used to the fact that it's June already. I saw it to my big surprise just now. And anyway, a pleasure welcoming you here. And it's also good to see that we have a really good group of alumni coming together here today. And I wish you, I think, not only a very enlightening hour or two when we have our keynote speaker today here, but we will also have a panel discussion in the afternoon where we talk more about the internal matters and the development of the school, and I very much look forward to that discussion as well. And I think later on in the evening there will be a dinner where we can also catch up with each other and do what we normally do on Alumni Day, right? Exchange gossip and see who's doing what and what everybody's been up to. So welcome again, and I would like to take a few moments to introduce our keynote speaker today, but I'm sure he doesn't really need much of an introduction, certainly in this country. Avi Primor is, for many people, certainly in the world of politics, a household name, and we've been trying on various occasions to attract him to come to the school and give a presentation. And we're so happy that it worked out this time. So thank you very much for coming all the way from Tel Aviv to Berlin today. Well, how to summarize a life that is as rich and varied in many ways as Avi's. He was born in Tel Aviv before the State of Israel was created. And he studied political science and international relations at Hebrew University on Mount Scopus in Jerusalem. And he entered diplomatic service at a very young age. And I was thinking, this is actually the age, it's the average age of the Hertie School graduate, which is about 27. Right? So the average age of Hertie School students entering the school is 25. And then 2 years on, right? So you're 27. And 27, Avi became the ambassador to what today is the Republic of Benin in West Africa. And I think at that time that made you the youngest ambassador ever to be appointed by the State of Israel. And then, so... And then in 75, and you worked at various places in Africa, and then from 75 to 87, you served in various roles in the foreign ministry, and then were appointed ambassador to the European Union, as well as ambassador in Belgium and Luxembourg in the late 80s. In 1991, you took leave of absence from the foreign ministry, and you became the vice president of Hebrew University. And there you founded what became and is still a very influential institute for people in this country. You founded what today is called the Helmut Institute. And that institute aims at fostering the relations and deepening the relations between Israel and Europe. And then on suggestion by Shimon Peres, Avi was appointed ambassador to Germany in 1995, and in that role, you became really a very dominant actor, a very important actor in driving forward Israeli-German relations, and in fact, a dialogue between the two countries. You have been awarded the Mérite Européen for your contributions to European unification, and also I think what is it's an interesting translation here, but I think that means Große Bundesverdienstkreuz of the Federal Republic here. And then you left diplomatic service in 1999, and you became the vice president of the University of Tel Aviv. And since 2004, you have worked at the Interdisciplinary Center Herzliya, and since 2010, you served as president of the Israeli Council, or the Israel Council on Foreign Relations, which is an independent think tank on matters of foreign policy in general. And I think that role takes you to many different capitals of the Middle East and beyond. And certainly while in Germany, and that's why many in this country know the name so well, you have always been outspoken, and you continue to be a contributor to the public debate on Middle East policy, on Israel, but also on Europe. And I think that mixture of somebody who understands the complexity of the Middle East, somebody who understands the complexity of Europe in the world, makes you, I think, a perfect person to deliver a keynote address at the Hertie School on this rather rainy, unfortunately, and dark 1st of June. Welcome again to the Hertie School, and we all look forward to your talk today. We agreed that Avi would, I think, talk for about half an hour, 40 minutes, and then we would have an extended Q&A for about the same period of time that I have the privilege of managing and moderating then. Thank you. Welcome again.
Thank you very much, Professor Anheier. This was a bit too long, almost an obituary for me, but it was nice listening to it. I'm sorry you had to listen to so many personal details. I don't think this is really what you came to hear for. I have, Professor Anheier, you wrote to me that I was going to speak on as follows: reflecting Germany, a new role in Europe and in the world. And then we had a discussion just half an hour ago, and you seem to be much more interested in the Middle East than in Germany. I don't know why. But I'll try to combine the two. And let's talk about the Middle East first, because the situation in the Middle East is very easy to understand. The Americans would say it's as clear as mud. So you can say anything you want, whereas Germany is much clearer. When one speaks about the Middle East today, one would speak about the situation in Syria, to begin with, because it's burning, the dangers for Lebanon, where I wouldn't be surprised if a new civil war would break out there. I think the role of the Hezbollah in the Syrian civil war foments a new civil war in Lebanon. This is the real danger. And then, of course, we have the game of the powers. Why does Russia support the regime in Syria? Why does Iran support the regime in Syria? What interest does the Hezbollah have to participate in the fighting, where they lost at least 500 men, fighters, already a week ago? And they're not that big and they're not that rich. What role do the other Arab countries play? And there is no common position of the Arab world toward the situation in Syria. This is all extremely complicated, and I can tell you one thing: when we talk about Syria, I have only one conviction, namely that nobody really knows what goes on. And when I say nobody, I don't mean people in the academy, I don't mean journalists, even journalists who specialize in Middle Eastern affairs. I mean the professionals, the secret services of Israel, of the United States, of other countries who are more or less involved or at least concerned, don't really know what goes on. Because one thing is clear: we have a civil war. It's not a war between a population that revolts against a dictator or dictatorial regime. It's a war between two parts of the same nation. It's part of the struggle that goes on within the Muslim world. It's a struggle for power between the Sunnites and the Shiites. It's certainly part of it, but there is also a struggle within Syria. We know that Syria is governed by a minority of not more than 10%, but the fact is that many parts of the population, particularly the minorities in the country, support the regime. First and foremost, the Christians. The Christians are almost 10% of the population in Syria. It's the biggest Christian population in the Arab world, aside from the Copts in Egypt. And they support the regime because the regime protected them. The regime protected them as a minority. All the other minorities, the Druze, the Kurds, there are a whole lot of them, and even a certain Sunnite bourgeoisie that could emerge thanks to the policies of the regime, stand behind the regime, and that's why the outcome is not clear. At the same time, we don't know who the rebels are. We know who the rebels originally were, but this develops, and it's a moving terrain. We don't know who is going to take over there, and if the Americans hesitate, and if till shortly the Europeans hesitated, when asked if they would support the rebels, in spite of the fact that they do not want to support Assad, they hesitate because they don't know who the rebels are. Who will really dominate the rebels? In last analysis, if it won't be the Al-Qaeda. You know, that reminds me a little bit of the Spanish Civil War. Originally, this war, 1936, was a war between the fascists, or the army, or the rebel army, and the Republicans, the Democrats. Called the Republicans were a democratic regime. They were. And Franco kept saying that he was fighting the communists. At the end, he was right. At the end of the Civil War, the Republican part was really dominated by the communists. Even though volunteers came from all over the world, but the communists were the best organized. They had the support of Moscow. They had discipline, they had money, they had the arms. Slowly, slowly, they took over. And it wasn't so false at the end when Franco said that he was fighting the communists. The fact that he was an ally of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy was a different story, but the Democrats were really overtaken by the communists. And the question is, in Syria, we don't see the same thing, that the fundamentalists take over because they're the best organized, they have the best means. So we don't know. We Israelis don't even know what's good for us. Astonishingly, the Israeli government hardly issued an opinion on the situation in Syria, which is not very typical for Israeli governments. Neither did we issue an opinion about the evolution in Egypt, because we didn't know what's good for us. On the one hand, if you look at Syria, Assad is a dictator, okay. But it's not a religious state that he runs or that his father ran. It's not a religious state, which is an advantage for Israel. We can come to terms with a regime that is not bound by religion much easier than with a religious regime in the Muslim world. We came to terms with Iran before the fundamentalists took over. We had good relations with Egypt before the fundamentalists took over, even though over there it's still holding somehow. In every country, Syria was an enemy, clear. But at least we knew who we dealt with. And we negotiated with Assad the father and Assad the son. 5 Israeli prime ministers negotiated with both Assads. And every time we were very, very close to signing a peace agreement, and then something happened. But whatever we signed with the Assad family, we knew was sincere, would hold. If we signed a ceasefire agreement, we knew that we won't get one single shot fired from Syria. And this is so, which is not the case with other countries. Not because the leaders of other countries were not of goodwill, but because they didn't control their own situation as well as the Assads did. On the other hand, Assad is an ally of Iran, our greatest enemy at the moment, the most dangerous enemy. And Iran has its stooges in South Lebanon, the Hezbollah, who are a danger for Israel, particularly because they get all the missiles from Iran. And the missiles go through Syria. or used to go through Syria. So the Hezbollah is an Iranian position on the Israeli border, supported by Syria, this Assad with whom we liked so much to negotiate. So if the enemies of Assad will come to power, and they will sever their relations with Iran, which is most likely, because they will be Sunnites, will that be better for Israel or worse? We don't know. It's unbelievable when you talk to secret services or to the American secret services and what a dilemma they find themselves. They don't know. So let's try to talk about the situation in Israel, in Palestine. Let's talk about a peace process. Can we have a peace process in the Middle East? We know that the Middle Eastern problems are not related to the Israeli-Palestinian problem. Not because of Israel came the revolution in Iran or in Tunisia or in Egypt or in Libya or today in Syria. It has nothing to do with Israel. But the atmosphere and public opinion, the feelings of public opinion are very much influenced by the situation in Palestine. It's an emotional issue for the people, and therefore it has its influence. Now, when you ask anyone in Israel, in the Arab world, in Europe, in America, anywhere, is peace in the Middle East possible? Most people will tell you no. First of all, we don't see any peace process to begin with. Secondly, which is worse, there have been so many peace processes and it never succeeded. I mean, we did sign peace, some sort of a peace with Egypt. We did sign some sort of a peace with Jordan. But peace with the Palestinians, which is the nucleus of the problem, is not in sight, even though we did have various agreements with the Palestinians and various negotiations, and there have been so many peace conferences. So maybe after 65 years of a state of war, we should come to the conclusion that peace is not possible, simply not realistic. And you know something? For many years, it was really so. Peace was indeed not possible in the Middle East. Everybody knew it, but nobody admitted it. Because you won't find anyone, anywhere, at any time, who will say he's against peace. The worst of the warmongers will tell you that they want nothing else but peace. How can you say it differently? And I say peace was really not possible for two reasons. One reason was that the Arab world, including the Palestinians, did not want to accept the very existence of Israel. You know, I suppose you all know the history. 1948, the United Nations decided to end the British colonial rule in Palestine, the mandate, and to partition the land in two parts, more or less equal. Propose one half to the Jews of Palestine so they could declare their independence, and this 50% of Palestine, of British mandatory Palestine, and the other half, the Arabs of Palestine. By the way, we were all at that time defined as Palestinians. The reason was that the very first so-called Palestinian government in history was the British colonial government, which was not a government. It was a colonial regime, but they called themselves a government, and they called themselves a government, so they called all the inhabitants Palestinians. When I was born, you mentioned it, 1935, I was born under British mandate. So I was defined as a Palestinian. In parentheses, British subject. Nationality Palestinian, British subject. So we didn't like that because it was a colonial definition. And the Arabs of Palestine didn't like it either because for them it was also a colonial definition. They thought they were Arabs, part of the Arab world, Arab nationalists, not necessarily Palestinians. So at the beginning, they were not really enthusiastic about creating a separate Palestinian entity. They wanted to be part of the Arab world, and they thought that the entire Middle East should be part of the Arab world. And therefore, they had their objections to the existence of an entity that was not part of the Arab world, a foreign entity which Israel meant to them. So they decided to prevent the implementation of the partition plan. They attacked the Jewish community in Palestine, the community that did greet with enthusiasm the decision of the United Nations. We were happy to have a part of Palestine because for us the essential thing was to have some sovereignty. It was very urgent at that time. We had to find shelter for the survivors of the Holocaust. We had different conditions than the Palestinians and different ideas and ambitions. And the Palestinians wanted to prevent a foreign entity on Arab soil, as they considered it. As they didn't succeed in preventing the existence of the State of Israel, they called the Arab so-called brothers, the already independent Arab states, the neighboring states, to help them. And with that began an invasion with the aim to prevent the very existence of the State of Israel. As the Arab states also failed in their mission, they could not destroy Israel, they could not prevent the existence of Israel. They didn't really acknowledge their defeat because their defeat didn't make sense. Here were so many Arab states with organized armies, with riches, they had oil, many of them, against a little community. You know what Israel was when we declared our independence? 600,000 inhabitants, that was all. 600,000. With no industry, we had little agriculture, but we hardly had any industry, and certainly not organized armed forces. The British wouldn't allow it. So we had underground movements standing against organized armies. So what did the Arabs say? What did the Palestinians say? What did the leaders of the Arab world say? There's been betrayal, something went wrong, something didn't work according to logic, according to plan. But of course, we, the Arab world, can defeat this little entity of 600,000 inhabitants who don't have anything. So if we failed the first time, we'll repeat it a second time. But eventually, we'll get this foreign entity out of the Middle East. As long as the Palestinians and the Arabs believed that they could destroy Israel, not that they wanted to, not that they thought it was right to do it, but they believed it was doable, they had no reason to sign peace with Israel. Sure, you need here and there technical arrangements for the time being. Provisional arrangements. This we signed with the Arabs. But a recognition and acceptance of the very existence of Israel was out of the question. Because not only they thought we had no right to be there, but they believed they could really chase us out. They were so much bigger and more powerful and richer. As long as the Arabs believed they would indeed, in fact, do away with Israel, they had no reason to sign peace with Israel. Of course, they all spoke about peace, but that, as I said, everybody does so. In Israel, there was a different atmosphere at the beginning. I told you we were very enthusiastic about the UN decision, and we accepted the partition plan. But after 1967, everything changed. In 1967, the Six-Day War, we conquered those parts of Palestine that were due to become part of the Palestinian state. They were annexed either by Jordan or by Egypt or some parts by Israel itself. But in 1967, we conquered them. Now, what are those parts of Palestine? When you talk about the West Bank, everybody says the West Bank is Palestinian. But for Jews, the West Bank is not just a part of Israel, not just the Jewish heritage. It is the very nucleus of Jewish heritage. Because if you read the Bible, you'll see that the Jewish kingdoms in biblical times were not in Tel Aviv or in Haifa or in Beersheba, which you know. They were in the West Bank. The cities of the West Bank were the cities of the Jewish kingdoms until the final destructions by Rome. So the real heritage of the Jewish people, for those who believe in that, is the West Bank. We were ready to abandon our claim to the West Bank within the framework of the partition plan because we needed a state urgently wherever it is. But afterwards, since the Arabs did not recognize the partition plan, afterwards, well, we conquered it, and we said, now everything is different. There's no reason for us to abandon it now. After all, it belongs to us, doesn't it? Well, read the Bible, you'll see. And if you're a religious man, you will say that this is a divine promise. It's not just nationalism, it's not just history, it's not just the fact that our kingdoms were there, it's what God wants. So you don't even have the right to abandon it. Even if you think it's important for you or if it's important for peace, you have no right. This is God's will. This is what the religious people will tell you till today. But after 1967, all of the Israelis, with hardly any exceptions whatsoever, really believed that we had no reason anymore to abandon the West Bank. We were ready to give it up, but now we have it. There's no reason why we should give it up. It belongs to us, so it will stay in Israel. From that moment on, from the Israeli point of view, peace became just as impossible as from the Arab point of view. For the Arab point of view, peace was impossible because they didn't want to accept Israel. After 1967, peace became impossible because the Israelis declared that they wouldn't abandon the West Bank. So where should a Palestinian state exist, if not in the West Bank? So all those who in the last dozens of years spoke about peace didn't really mean it. You say peace because you have to. It's lip service. Everybody does that. But nobody really believed in it. And this situation has totally changed, profoundly changed. For the Arab world, it began with President Sadat of Egypt. He came to Israel in 1977, reached us his hand, and we started the first peace process, the first real peace process in the Middle East that led us at the end to a peace agreement with Egypt. What did he say at that time? He said, I would have been very happy to live in a Middle East in which there is no state of Israel. This is really my wish. But unfortunately, really unfortunately, I must come to the understanding that this is simply not realistic, not doable. What we couldn't have done 30 years ago when Israel was nothing, a little community of 600,000 people, but no, with no real economy, with no industry, with no organized armed forces, we won't be able to do today, 30 years later, when Israel has become a regional power from every point of view, and also internationally recognized. So if I come to the conclusion that Israel is here to stay, unfortunately, if I'm damned to live with this state, why should I live in a state of war and grant all my economic possibilities to the armed forces? I should invest in the development of Egypt and the development of my population. So I don't like the Israelis, but I need this peace for my own country. And let me tell you one thing. I mentioned before the existence of a fundamentalist government in Egypt today after the revolution, after the elections that brought the Muslim Brothers to power. Everybody said the first thing they will do will annul the peace agreement with Israel. They didn't. Why? Because Sadat didn't sign a peace agreement out of love for Israel. He signed a peace agreement because he thought it was an Egyptian interest. And it is an Egyptian interest. And everybody who comes to power must acknowledge it. So I think the Muslim brothers wouldn't have had the guts to sign peace with Israel or recognize Israel. But once they have it, they find it as a fact. They know that it's within their own interest and they won't abandon it. Same thing goes for Jordan. Same thing would have gone for Syria had we signed a peace agreement with Assad. So he said simply, the destruction of Israel is not doable. So I have to live with reality, even if I dislike this reality. At that particular moment, the Arab world did not follow him. On the contrary, short of one, all the Arab countries severed their diplomatic relations with Egypt at that time, the biggest, most important Arab country. Today, I would say the entire Arab world sees it the way Sadat saw it. Nobody likes Israel, nobody. I would say most of them hate Israel, emotionally. But they've come to the conclusion that they're damned to live with such a state in the Middle East. There's no solution. That's why they're ready for peace, under their conditions. But principally, in their mentality, they have come to the conclusion that they will, if they like it or not, continue to live with the state of Israel in the Middle East. So that, from the Arab point of view, made peace possible. I'm not saying that it would be easy, because of course they had their demands. But principally, it has become possible. It has become realistic. On the Israeli side, there's also a total change of public opinion. If after 1967, almost all of the Israelis were really convinced with enthusiasm that the heart of the biblical Jewish kingdoms that is now in our hands will remain forever in our hands, they don't believe in it anymore. Not because they don't think that the West Bank belongs to us, they do think it belongs to us. But they know that we can't hold it, it's not realistic. There's a different population that lives there, and there's no way we can get rid of this population, we can't chase them, we can't kill them, they're there. And supposing we annex them, by the way, no right-wing Israeli government, no nationalistic Israeli government that preaches to the whole world that the West Bank belongs to us has ever dared to annex the West Bank. Why? Because they know that we cannot digest the West Bank. Not out of consideration for human rights. What do we do with the population if we annex them? We can't chase them away. Not that we haven't tried here and there, but we can't. We can't install a regime of apartheid. The Israeli population will not accept that. The world will not accept that. That's not realistic. So you have to give them this, you have to grant them the Israeli nationality. And then what? Today we have about 7 million Jews in Israel, 1.5 million Palestinians who are Israeli citizens. If we annex the Palestinian territories, we annex 4.5 million Palestinians, and the demographic development of the Palestinians is much, much quicker, more important than the demographic development of the Israeli population, which is not as bad as in Germany, but still, big difference with the Arab population. And you know what? In a short while, they will be the majority. In being elected to the Israeli parliament in Jerusalem, they will promulgate a law saying that the state of the Jews is not the state of the Jews anymore. It's the state of, I don't know whom, of Middle Eastern citizens. There's no Jewish state. If they're the majority, they can do it. So what have we done? I mean, there are many considerations that have brought to it that we never annexed the West Bank. And the Israeli population has grown ever more conscious of the fact that we cannot annex it and we cannot swallow it, and we cannot digest it. So I'm talking about the majority, not about the entire population. If you take the public opinion polls in Israel in the last 10 years, 15 years, you will see a permanent phenomenon that about 70%, something between 65 and 75%, depending on the daily events, will tell you that they consider it an Israeli interest to separate from the West Bank, to evacuate the West Bank. In other words, to agree to a Palestinian state. The considerations could be different, even contradictory, but you have a permanent, a stable majority who not just agrees to separate from the West Bank, but thinks it is a necessity. It's an Israeli interest. You have 25%, 30% to continue to think like before. Yeah, this is a divine promise, and we have no right to abandon it, and God will help us, and we'll get rid of the Arab majority. There will be miracles, all kinds of things, you know. I mean, God always helped us. There were always miracles. God helped us wherever we were. We Jews, for instance, in Auschwitz, we knew that we can always depend on God, so they continued to believe so. Fine. But the majority doesn't see it this way. By the way, in the Arab world, you also have a very important minority that hasn't changed its mind, that still believes that they have to destroy Israel, particularly the fundamentalists, but not the majority. And if the majority on both sides is today ready to accept one another without any love, out of sheer interest, nothing else, then peace has become possible. Now, the question is, if all of us understand this evolution, you can always ask, well, if the majority wants peace, and when you want peace, that means you're ready to pay the price of peace, not just to shout on the roofs that you want peace. For an Israeli, that means to abandon the occupied territories. There's no other way to express the will of peace, because otherwise there will be no peace. You know, we have a party today, a new party. In fact, the party of the settlers. Everybody calls it the Bennett Party because Bennett is the creator and the chief of this party. And he says, I'm against negotiations with the Palestinians. No, of course not. I'm all in favor. If the government wants to negotiate with the Palestinians, by all means. But I know that nothing will come out of it, so who cares? In other words, if something will come out of it, I will fight against it. I will torpedo the coalition. But as long as you just want to talk, it doesn't bother me. This is a very important minority, but a minority that governs. And why does it govern? If you say that the majority of the Israelis is in favor of peace, in other words, in favor of abandoning the West Bank, why do they elect governments that are principally, basically, ideologically against any abandoning of the West Bank? And the reason is very simple. The reason is that the major problem that really interests the Israelis seems to be in a deadlock. You see, when Sadat came to Israel, he said from the beginning, I'm willing to sign peace with Israel, I'm willing to recognize Israel, but I want all of my territories back to the very last centimeter. I don't know how you measure in the sands of the deserts a centimeter, but that's how he expressed himself. Not a meter, a centimeter. Kept repeating it in all of his speeches in Israel. And he said, all of the settlements you've built on Egyptian soil will have to be not only evacuated, but by you destroyed. Because I don't want any people to remain nostalgic in Israel. Go to Egypt and say, this was my home, this is where I was born, this is where my kids were raised. No, this has to be erased, and you have to do it. Our government was not at all in agreement on that. We had the first Likud government at that time, it was a Begin government, and they said, okay, Sadat made a gesture, very brave, came to Israel, very, very brave, got into a struggle with the entire Arab world. I mean, what can you ask more? So we also have to make a gesture, and we'll give him 50% of his lost territories. Anyway, none of the territories on which we have built settlements, certainly not. Totally ridiculous. Sadat would never have even considered such a proposition. What did he do? He convinced Israeli public opinion. Sadat convinced Israeli public opinion against the Israeli government. This is, by the way, something that Obama, in a speech in Israel at the beginning of this year, repeated. He asked the Israeli public to exercise pressure on its own government, because the government of Israel, he said when he was in Israel, will never initiate anything unless there's pressure from below, from public opinion. And this is what happened when Sadat came. Why? Because Sadat knew how to convince Israeli public opinion. He kept telling the Israelis one thing for which he prepared himself in advance. He wrote that in his diaries. He didn't have any clue of what Israelis were like. When he decided to go to Israel because they thought it was an Egyptian interest to end the state of war, he invited all kinds of experts in Israel to ask them, what kind of people are these Israelis? How do you speak to them? What mentality do they have? What psychology? And he discovered that the Israelis have only one interest, and that's security, not peace, security. Because Israelis don't know what peace means. Israel never lived in peace. We always lived in a state of war. We live like an island in the Middle East. And we find this natural. Peace, there's something in the skies, something in heaven, something idealistic, religious. But when you deal with real affairs, peace doesn't have any meaning. Security, that's something we understand. We were faced with security problems ever since we were born. We were born in a war. Afterwards, we had to conduct wars ever again. We suffered from terrorist attacks. We attacked ourselves. Always a state of war, always problems of security in Israel, for Israelis worldwide. This is a problem we know, we understand. When Sadat promised us peace and meant security and gave us guarantees that seemed to be credible for us, then we agreed. What do we need the territories for? What do we need the settlements for? If we can have security, we can abandon them. And this is what happened. Sadat did get all of his territories to the last centimeter, as he said, and we ourselves dismantled all of the, not just evacuated, dismantled all of the settlements on Egyptian soil. And the same procedure repeated itself later with Jordan, when also the king of Jordan, Hussein, spoke to the Israelis directly and always about security. Okay, now we have a partner called Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian government in Ramallah. And most of the Israelis, not all of them, at least those who really want to pay the price of peace, say that Mahmoud Abbas is an honest person. He's against terrorism, he's against war. He really means it when he speaks about peace. He wants it. The problem is he has no power. He has the will, but he has no power to guarantee us security. He cannot. He can't even guarantee his own security. If we leave the West Bank, who knows what's going to happen to him? Probably what happened to his government in Gaza. The fundamentalists took over. So what will happen? Today, we suffer from rockets in Gaza, out of the Gaza Strip, a territory that we evacuated of our own free will. We decided that. Nobody pushed us outside. And we suffer. Instead of getting security, we have much more danger. If this scenario will repeat itself in the West Bank, it'll be a catastrophe for Israel, because the Gaza Strip is somewhere on the side. In the little dimensions of the Middle East, it is considered to be far away. It is not, but it's everything is relative. But the West Bank, if you look at the map, finds itself in the belly of Israel, in the middle of Israel. The most primitive rockets of the Hamas can reach any town in Israel if fired from the West Bank. They can reach the airport, they can reach the seaports, they can reach the high-tech industry on which the economy of Israel today is based, in every city. Not the Russian missiles, not the Iranian missiles, the most primitive rockets that the Hamas produces in Gaza today. Absolutely impossible. We cannot admit such a thing. If there is no real power in the West Bank that can guarantee a security, just like Sadat did, just like King Hussein did, we cannot, not that we don't want to, we cannot abandon the West Bank. We don't have the means to it. And therefore, saying that abandoning the West Bank is an Israeli interest is true, but it's wishful thinking. It's not doable. And if it's not doable, don't talk to me about that. We had elections not so long ago, a few months ago. This time, the Likud lost about a quarter of its voters. The entire nationalistic camp lost many votes. And the center, the moderate center, emerged as a new power. But the interesting thing is that neither this new central power in Israeli politics, nor the traditional opposition of the Labour Party, in their election campaign even mentioned the Palestinian problem or the occupation or the settlements or peace negotiations. Why? Because, people, when you want to convince them to vote for you, you have to talk to them about problems that preoccupy them. If you have a problem that preoccupies you, and you come and say, if you vote for me, I will be the one who will solve your problem. Your problem is this and this and that. I have the solutions for your problem. Then you have a chance to convince him to vote for you. If you would come and tell the Israelis who believe in peace and think that we have to abandon the West Bank, if you'll come and talk to them about the Palestinians, about negotiations, about territories and all that, is that, look, leave me alone. All this is theoretical. We know that there's nothing doing. There is no solution for the security. So leave me alone. Talk to me about problems that really preoccupied me, that you can, and that you can modify or change. For instance, the economic problems, the social problems, they are problems that really preoccupy us, and for them we want to have solutions. And this is doable. So don't talk to me about theoretical things which you can't change anyway. This was more or less the tactic of most of the parties in Israel when they went to elections. Either they were right-wing, in favor of the occupation and of the settlements, or they said, this is not a matter that we can discuss in the campaign. There were only two parties in Israel who officially and stubbornly spoke about the necessity of negotiations and of peace. Those two parties together got 10% of the electorate. Even though in the public opinion polls, as I told you, there are about 70% who think we should abandon the West Bank. But they want to deal with problems that can be solved and not theoretical problems. Therefore, I think we today have the most anti-peace government we ever had. Because today it's not just the right wing, it's the moderate who support the right-wing policies in the Middle East and the occupied territories with the settlements by not opposing what the Prime Minister or the others do, because they believe they cannot. Yeah, that's the end of it. So there's only one way to get out of the problem, and that is to find a solution to the real preoccupation of the Israeli public opinion, of the Israeli population, to propose a solution for the security problems once we sign a peace agreement with the Palestinians and abandon the West Bank. This can only be done by the international community, not by the Palestinians. They don't have the means, not by the Arab world. even though the Arab world proposes peace negotiations with Israel and recognition of Israel in its whole, the international community pays lip service to peace, but when it comes to, how do you say in good German, to tacheles, to practical things, they disappear. Obama made a fantastic speech in Israel. He overturned Israeli public opinion, who was anti-Obama before he came, and became totally enthusiastic of him. But when it came to proposing something concrete, we didn't hear from him anymore. And he sent Kerry. Kerry runs around in the Middle East and meets all the leaders and speaks about peace process, but he repeats exactly that, what his predecessors did, and failed. There we are today. So now I'll stop because you want me to answer questions. So.